as far back as the Nixon administration when that presidency was under some investigation as well.
Then if it's absolute nonsense what Rudy Giuliani is asking for, what would Mueller's next strategic move be if he wants to sit down with Trump?
Well, he has two options. One is just to go forward without it. There's nothing mandating that he sit down with Trump. I mean, any good prosecutor is going to want to determine whether there are any inconsistent statements, and also just to, dot I's and cross T's to make sure everything is consistent with what they've understood. Alternatively, they could subpoena him, and we saw this with President Clinton during the Whitewater investigation. In that instance, President Clinton agreed to sit down in exchange for withdrawal of the subpoena and certain terms to govern the testimony. That could happen here. But I mean, Mr. Trump's been dangling the idea of testifying for about a year now. And I think it's more likely he'll just kick the can down the road and see how it works out politically with the next election and, tell the voters, listen, you decide, kind of like what McConnell did with the Supreme Court pick. We don't know. But if it did come to a subpoena, then the next step would be the president saying no. And then that could produce a contempt citation. And then that would certainly go to the courts to determine the extent to which the president can thumb his nose at a valid criminal investigation process. And when I say valid, it's one that's consistent with the rule of law. And once the rule of law starts to fall apart, then we're on a fast track to tyranny, regardless of political party. So I do think this is a very high stakes game of chicken right now.
Oof. All right. Well, I also want to play what Giuliani said about Michael Flynn.
What he said to him was, can you give me a break?
Comey says he took it as direction.
Well, that's okay. I mean, I've taken it that way. I mean, by that time, he had been fired. The reality is, as a prosecutor, I was told that many times, can you give the man a break? Either by his lawyers, by his relatives, by friends. You take that into consideration. But that doesn't determine that not going forward with it.
Can you give the man a break? Is that true as a prosecutor in the Whitewater investigation? Did you get asked that all the time?
Well, I mean, the difference here is that the president is the president, and the client here has some control over these potential witnesses. So, no, of course, prosecutors get influenced, or at least attempt to be influenced by people that could be affected by what's the work of the prosecutor. I mean, lawyers are trying to get the best deal for their clients, but this is a really different situation when the president is under Article 2 of the in charge of the criminal justice system at the federal level. And so traditionally, the FBI and the DOJ have stayed separate from presidential influence, not because it's required by the Constitution, but because that's how we keep our system of justice legitimate and independent. So we are potentially crossing lines here. Now, whether this gives rise to a criminal charge, obstruction of justice, or witness tampering, that's a different question. Because you have to show intent, and that's a really high standard of proof.
All right, I want to ask about the power of discrediting Bob Mueller. We can talk all day long about his track record, who he is, what he's achieved in his life. But the president has been masterful at attacking him. And just this weekend, he attacked the Russia probe again via Twitter, saying public opinion has turned strongly against the rigged witch hunt and the special counsel because the public understands that there was no collusion with Russia, so ridiculous that the two FBI lovers were a fraud against our nation and that the only collusion was with the Democrats. Now, irrelevant of fact-checking the president's tweet, he's not wrong about public opinion. A new Washington Post poll found that 45% of Americans disapprove of Robert Mueller's handling of the investigation. That is a 14-point increase since January. And you and I both know since January, we've seen a flood of indictments. So is the president's strategy and wheeling out Rudy Giuliani working?
Well, I mean, if public opinion is the metric, presumably, and the problem is that this could actually come down to a political resolution. I think there is a strong argument that an indictment would be problematic under the Constitution. That's not resolved, but I think Rod Rosenstein would probably respect the established practice of the Department of Justice to pay attention to the Office of Legal Counsel's determination that he couldn't indict him. So then there would be a political method of accountability if there is wrongdoing demonstrated, and that would come down to an impeachment process. And if at all. And so the voters have to pay attention to that. I mean, this is really the difference that you point out between Nixon and even the Whitewater probe, and that is that a lot of this is playing out with, frankly, lies and distortions out of the White House. And, we hear these things and it starts to become part of what we understand as truth. B, I think there also is just a fatigue factor. The problems out of this administration have been so many and so quick and so massive in scale that I think people are just trying to go on with their lives, and they're losing focus on where the eye and the ball should be. And here, in my mind, as a constitutional law professor, in addition to a former prosecutor in the Whitewater investigation, has to do with the system. Do we have a system where the people at the highest levels of government are accountable to the public for potential corruption? And we don't know exactly what happened here. But of course, I mean, to suggest that this is a witch hunt when we've seen what's come out of this investigation so far in terms of guilty pleas is really problematic. It's just not true.
Look at that picture again, please. This ain't no witch hunt. Kim, thank you so much. I appreciate you joining me this morning. It is stunning. The lies that continue to come out of the White House work. We can sit here all day long and say, why is it that Larry Kudlow